It was the Treasury Department which ran the Prohibition Bureau, but red tape and bureaucracy smothered any efficiency. They had only 1,500 agents to police America's 3 million square miles, with salaries of only $2,000 a year. Corruption was rife as inexperienced, low-paid men took on a nation of ingenious and determined drinkers. Selling one medicinal permit to a phony doctor could double an agent's salary. Their lifestyles did not reflect their earnings. Some would leave work in chauffeur-driven cars. Each agent had 2,000 square miles to patrol. It was a near miracle if their paths crossed those of a bootlegger. There was the odd success, but Prohibition agents made little impact on the growing liquor industry. Despite their extravagant claims, government cameras often happened to be there to record the event.
This is a part of 20,000 quarts of whiskey sealed Potomac Yards in the Eastern District of Virginia, now being destroyed under court order. Go to it, boys. Pull down the bag there. Go to it.
But for every bottle smashed, at least 100 were getting through. All that these phony raid films really revealed was just how wet America was. The Bureau did arrest hundreds of small-time bootleggers and speakeasy owners, but there are far more powerful figures behind the trafficking. George Remus was one. He'd been a Chicago lawyer before he turned to crime. He shelved his plans to be district attorney and became the king of the bootleggers instead. Remus was the inspiration for Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. He had style, he had money, and he had influence.
He sold his practice in Chicago, set up in Ohio as a bootlegger, and started buying up whiskey stocks and turning these whiskey stocks into medicinal whiskey, which was legal. And then, of course, the greed factor occurred, and he realized that he could make even more profits if he sold whiskey to other bootleggers, which he did. And within the space of 3 years, he had accumulated assets worth about $40 million then, which can be multiplied by 10, at least in terms of US values today. In other words, he was a billionaire.
Outside Cincinnati, Remus built Death Valley Farm, a hidden liquor depot. The building was fitted with an underground bottling plant and employed over 3,000 people. The farm was guarded night and day by armed men. Armored trucks full of liquor were dispatched across the country. There seemed no end of customers.
The demand is greater than the supply of whiskey. People come from all over the country to consult and try to obtain my liquor.
Remus bought a vast mansion near Cincinnati. Influential citizens, society girls, and politicians vied for invitations to his wild and lavish parties. In 1922, when he opened his Olympic-sized swimming pool, guests were presented with gold-engraved Elgin watches and diamond tie clasps. In the early hours of the morning, as the partygoers left, each of the 50 ladies was presented with a brand new Pontiac. On the back of his whiskey profits, Remus paid off the local police and feds.
A greedier lot of parasites never existed. I tried to corner the graft market. but there isn't enough money in the world to buy up all the officials who demand their share of it.
Remus's dirty money filled the pockets of the highest powers in the land, the senior members of the Harding administration. To President Harding, Prohibition had just been a means to an end. For him, the dry vote had been the path to power.
Warren Harding was president when Prohibition first became effective. He was probably the worst person you could possibly choose as president at the beginning of Prohibition. First of all, he was a fairly heavy drinker. Secondly, he was, if not corrupt, so weak and so passive that he was entirely in the hands of a coterie of Ohio politicians who were incredibly corrupt.
Had Harding been stronger as a president, Prohibition may have stood more of a chance. But Harding was vulnerable and he could be blackmailed. His affair with Nan Britton, a 20-year-old shop girl and the mother of his child, was a secret his administration kept from the press. But it could have ruined Harding, and it gave his advisors power. Harry Daugherty was Harding's Attorney General. He was responsible for fighting crime in America, but few acted more criminally than this man. It later came out that during his term in office, Daugherty was receiving huge bribes from bootleggers like George Remus. In return for $300,000 a year protection payments, Daugherty kept Remus out of prison. The president's blind eye to Daugherty's crimes showed just how close authority and criminality were. The escalating organization of crime and the powers of federal bureaucracy. On either side of the law, men found themselves battling both. They seemed to be working hand in hand. The law and the outlaw. Fighting one meant fighting both. Prohibition agent Izzy Einstein began his career fighting bootleggers and ended it fighting federal authority. Einstein, who'd been a postal clerk, became the most famous law enforcer in America. He made more arrests in New York State than any other agent. Along with his partner Mo Smith, Einstein became a master of disguise, posing as gamblers, coalmen, showmen, and even as a Jewish couple.
By becoming a character, I popularized Prohibition.
So long as Einstein was arresting small-time liquor dealers, he was a hero. But when he raided the 21 Club, he overstepped the mark. There he found the most powerful men of the dry government wetting their whistles. Peter Kriendler's family ran the 21 Club.
Everybody who was anybody tried to get in here. And the great thing about our inside doorman, Jimmy was his name, he knew them exactly. Like if the Rockefellers came in, the Kennedy family, Mr. Joe, the father, would come in here every so often. You name them, they would, when they would come to New York, they would be in here.
Einstein's raid was embarrassing for the Kriendlers' high society guests.
It was Izzy and Mo. One was a big tall fellow. He stood about 6'1" or 2. The other was a man of about... Izzy was a little roundy sort of chap. And they were in here once and never were successful about it. When the upstairs doorman felt that a raid maybe was in the offing, he would press a button which reacted to the bartender at the bar, and he in turn would press another button which collapsed the shelves on which the bottles of liquor rested, and the bottles dropped down right down into this cellar. Luckily, we had this wonderful, heavy brick wall door to protect the inside as you're sitting here, where all this whiskey was. And as much as the officers the people who raided the restaurant tried to find it by tapping on the wall all along, up and down and up. They never could find this door.
Some of them went down to the cellar. They tapped the walls for secret rooms, but they found nothing. They didn't know about the piece of wire near the olive bottles, how to poke it in and contact the big electric lock. Heavy bolts would have snapped back. 2 tons of brick would have opened into the main cellar where we kept thousands of dollars worth of fine liquors and rare wine.
Come again, boys. Sorry you couldn't find anything. Better luck next time.
The raid on the 21 Club was the end for Einstein and Smith. In 1925, allegedly due to administrative reorganization, they were fired. The 2 agents were not directly beaten by the forces of crime. They had confronted a corrupt, faceless federal power and lost. Policing the cities of the United States always put them in danger of stepping on powerful toes. In the rural Midwest, it should have been different. This is where the movement for Prohibition had started. Some states had been dry for 40 years. Nebraska had been since 1916. But deep in the hills, there were moonshiners. Richard Two Gun Hart was one of America's most famous moonshine chasers. He was based in Homer, Nebraska, and his job was to patrol the thousands of square miles around it and clear the state of moonshine. The stills were well established and hidden.
If you want to have to leave home, you just sit with a bottle of corn. You have to make it to the woods if you can.
His son, Harry Hart, remembers the trouble his father had tracking them down.
They put those stills just about anywhere. They'd put them in trees, anywhere they could find to hide them. Under bushes. They'd dig them in back into banks. And it was quite unique the way they would do it, to hide them. But they usually found them because they would set out and wait and watch. And pretty soon they'd find maybe somebody going somewhere, and that's the way they'd get them.
Two Gun Hart, like Prohibition agent Izzy Einstein, was driven by his idealism. He aimed his guns at the moonshiners and bootleggers hidden deep in the countryside. His bosses understood his value.
He is absolutely fearless, on the job all the time, both day and night. And when he goes after the liquor violators, he usually gets them. Before he came, moonshiners had little restraint in their operations, especially among the Indians. But at this time, one seldom sees an intoxicated Indian on the reservation. R.C. Craig, Superintendent of the Cheyenne Enforcement Agency.
White moonshiners targeted Native Americans. Two Gun Hart offered them protection.
But he stood up for the Indians, and they admired him. I think they admired everything about him.
Alone, spurred by his idealism, Two Gun took on the moonshiners and won. But far from the rural setting, Hart had a secret which plagued him. He wasn't the genuine roving cowboy. He was Brooklyn-born, the son of Italian immigrants. His real name was Vincenzo, but he'd always wanted to be like Bill Hart, the American hero. So he changed his name, bought a horse, and left for Nebraska. But while he doggedly countered the illegal alcohol industry in Nebraska, his brother in Chicago was creating the biggest liquor business in the Prohibition era. His brother was Al Capone. Lawbreaker and law enforcer, between these two Italian brothers stretched the entire spectrum of American attitudes to alcohol. Both lived by the gun, both craved respectability, both made their names from Prohibition, an unenforceable law. Hart kept the Capone connection a total secret. No one, not even Hart's wife and family, knew who he really was. But while Capone was growing in strength by creating an organization alone, Two Gun Hart found himself facing the organized powers of local government.